Before we get into tonight's story, I want to be really clear about what we're going to talk about. This is a case involving a very young child. We're going back to the 1950s, to the body of a little boy found alone in a cardboard box on the edge of the woods outside Philadelphia. There is child abuse. There is neglect. There is a homicide. I'm not going to dwell on graphic details or describe his injuries blow by blow, but the reality behind this case is heartbreaking. If stories involving harm to children are something you can't sit with right now, that is completely okay. You don't owe this video anything. Take care of yourself first. If you choose to stay, I want to keep the focus on three things: who this child was, how so many people and systems failed him, and how, even when we finally give someone back their name, that doesn't automatically give us all the answers we want. For more than 65 years, he was known only by a nickname: the boy in the box, America's unknown child. And his story begins on a cold, gray afternoon in February 1957, in the Fox Chase neighborhood on the far edge of Philadelphia. I want you to picture the scene. It's not Center City with skyscrapers and office towers. Fox Chase, back then, was a more rural, semi-suburban corner of the city. Fields, patches of woods, narrow roads with names like Susquehanna that cut between clusters of modest homes. It's winter in Pennsylvania. The trees are bare. The ground is cold and muddy, with patches of snow clinging to the shady spots. Along one of those roads, not far from a field where neighborhood kids might play or local hunters might set traps, someone dumps a cardboard box. It's not a fancy shipping crate, just the kind of box you'd get if you bought a baby's bassinet from a department store, light brown, printed with a logo, the edges going soft from the damp. The first person to see that box is a young man checking his animal traps. He spots it in the weeds, tilted at an angle, lid half open. He goes closer, curious. And what he sees inside is bad enough that his stomach flips. The body of a small child, naked, lying on a plaid blanket, too still. He panics. He's not supposed to be trapping there. He's worried the police will confiscate his traps or charge him. So he makes a choice that he would reportedly regret for the rest of his life. He walks away. He doesn't call. He doesn't tell. For a few more days, that little boy stays there in the box, alone in the cold. Then, a college student driving through the area spots a rabbit darting into the underbrush. Knowing there are traps around, he pulls over to check. He pushes through the brush, following the narrow trail, and sees the same cardboard box. When he looks inside, he finds what the first man found: the body of a young boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old, lying on a blanket, clearly dead. He goes home in shock. At first, he hesitates, afraid to get involved, unsure of what to do. But the next day, when he hears on the news that a little girl in a different part of the region has gone missing, his conscience won't let him stay quiet. He calls the police. And this time the authorities come. Police officers and detectives arrive on Susquehanna Road. They step out into the cold air, boots crunching on frozen ground, and follow the student back to the shallow clearing where the box lies. The scene they find is grim. The cardboard box, once used to ship a baby's bassinet from J.C. Penney, is open. Inside, wrapped loosely in a cheap plaid blanket, is the body of a small boy. He's naked. He has bruises on his body, scars that look like they've been there for a while, and a haircut that looks like it was done in a hurry. His hair choppily shorn, with clumps still stuck to his skin, as if someone cut it right before or after he died. He's thin, malnourished. This isn't a healthy, well-fed child who suddenly died from some acute injury. This is a little body that has been deprived for a long time. The medical examiner later determines that he's about 4 years old, maybe just a little older. He's suffered blunt force trauma to the head. There are surgical scars on his ankle, his groin, under his chin, suggesting he saw a doctor at some point in his short life. And there are signs of long-term physical abuse. The thing that hits the detectives most, though, is the sense of erasure. No clothes, no toy, no note. Nothing in that box that says who he belonged to. In 1957, investigators don't use phrases like homicide by blunt force trauma the way we do now. But they know what they're looking at. Someone killed this child and dumped him like trash. At first, though, there's a sliver of hope. Because in 1950s America, missing kids are rare enough, at least the ones that get reported, that detectives assume there has to be a family out there somewhere, frantic because their little boy is gone. They're thinking, a mother in tears, a father pacing, maybe a babysitter or a relative calling around. They take the boy's fingerprints. They take photos, carefully posed to show his face as gently as they can manage. They note his weight, height, scars. They check hospital records in the area, looking for a child whose surgical history might match the scars. And they wait for the phone to ring. It doesn't. No one steps forward to say, "That might be my son." No missing child reports in Philadelphia or neighboring counties match a boy of his age and description. No nearby hospital immediately recognizes the combination of surgical scars. That silence is the first really chilling thing about this case, because it suggests something that even seasoned detectives don't want to admit out loud at first. That whoever was supposed to protect this child either doesn't care that he's gone or is actively hiding the fact that he ever existed. The investigation ramps up fast. The Philadelphia Inquirer prints thousands upon thousands of flyers showing a reconstruction of the boy's face. They stuff them into gas bills so that nearly every household in the city gets one. His picture goes up in post offices, grocery stores, diners, police stations. Detectives physically walk the streets with those flyers, knocking on doors, asking if anyone recognizes him. The box itself becomes a clue. It's traced back to a J.C. Penney store in Upper Darby, just outside the city. It had originally contained a baby bassinet, one of about a dozen sold in that particular type of box. Investigators track down purchase records, try to find who bought each bassinet. For most of them, they succeed, confirming that the bassinets are still with families or accounted for. But one sale leads nowhere. It's a tantalizing almost lead. Someone bought a bassinet, got the box, and somehow that box ended up in a patch of scrubby woods with a dead child in it. But that someone can't be identified with the tools they have at the time. Police academy recruits are sent to comb the crime scene inch by inch. They fan out along Susquehanna Road, through the underbrush, searching for anything that looks like it shouldn't be there. They find a few items: a blue corduroy cap, a child's scarf, a men's handkerchief with the letter G embroidered on it. Investigators seize on these clues, testing them against suspects, showing them to witnesses. Nothing clicks. The press dubs him the boy in the box. Later, as the years stretch on, people will call him America's unknown child. Those names are meant to humanize him, but they also underline the central fact of the case. No one knows who he is. As days turn to weeks and then months, the case refuses to fade. This is the 1950s. There's no internet, no social media, but word of mouth and newspapers carry the story far beyond Philadelphia. People write in from other states with tips, theories, and desperate guesses. Families who lost children to illness, adoption, or custody disputes wondering if this boy could be theirs. Police follow up lead after lead. They check orphanages, foster homes, boarding houses. They look at families who have quietly sent a child to live with relatives, or have an odd gap in their household. They investigate a foster home not far from the crime scene, a place that housed many children over the years. There are rumors, half-whispers, that maybe the boy came from there. One local investigator, Remington Bristow from the medical examiner's office, becomes obsessed. He spends years of his life chasing this case, paying out of pocket for psychics, following hunches, visiting the foster home, haunting the little grave where the boy is eventually buried. Because at some point, the city has to make a decision about what to do with his body. He's not evidence anymore. He's a child who has to be laid to rest. They bury him in a potter's field, basically a city cemetery for the unknown and the poor. His grave is marked modestly. People start leaving flowers and toys. Even without a name, he gathers a sort of adopted family in the form of strangers who feel a connection to this little boy. Back in the investigation, years pass and technology creeps forward, but answers stay stubbornly out of reach. Different theories rise and fall. Some investigators are convinced he came from that nearby foster home. The timing, the distance, certain odd details, it all seems to line up. Others dig into the lives of traveling carnival workers, wondering if he belonged to a transient family that passed through and vanished. There are whispers that he might have been raised as a girl, based on the haircut and some details about grooming, leading to sketches and reconstructions imagining him with long hair. In 2002, decades after his body was found, a woman identified publicly only as Martha comes forward with a shocking story. She claims that when she was a child, her abusive mother acquired a boy, possibly purchased from his birth parents, and brought him into their home. She says that this boy, whom she remembers as Jonathan, was beaten and neglected. One night, she says, the abuse went too far and he died. According to her account, her parents then took his body out of the house and left him in a cardboard box somewhere outside the city. On the surface, the story fits certain elements of the case. Some investigators listen closely. They walk through her timeline, compare it to what they know about the boy's injuries. They even visit the neighborhood she names. But Martha has a documented history of mental illness. Neighbors from that time insist there was never such a boy in the house. No physical evidence supports her claims. In the end, her account becomes another maybe, in a case already full of them. Every time hope rises, a new confession, a fresh theory, it seems to crash back down under the weight of conflicting facts, unreliable memories, or dead ends. Meanwhile, time keeps marching on. The detectives who first walked Susquehanna Road retire, and then many of them pass away. The college student who found the box grows old, carries the memory of that day for the rest of his life. The city around the crime scene changes. Fox Chase becomes more built up. Susquehanna Road starts to look like just another street in a big American city, with commuters and kids on bikes and people walking dogs past the place where the box once lay. But the boy in the box never really leaves Philadelphia's consciousness. His image becomes one of those cases that true crime buffs trade stories about. Grainy black and white photos of a small face, eyes closed in death, hair rough cut. Books and magazine articles keep the mystery alive. Theories multiply, sometimes in thoughtful ways, sometimes veering into ghost stories and urban legend territory. Then in 1998, more than 40 years after he was buried, the city makes a decision that will eventually change everything. They exhume his body. This is done gently with ceremony. Detectives, forensic experts, and members of a private group called the Vidic Society, made up of retired investigators and profilers, are involved. The goal is to extract DNA, something no one even dreamed of in 1957, from his remains. They take samples of bone and teeth. They preserve strands of hair. Then they rebury him, this time in Ivy Hill Cemetery in northwest Philadelphia, under a new headstone. The stone bears an image of a small lamb and an inscription that simply reads, "America's unknown child." People visit this grave. They leave stuffed animals, toy cars, flowers. For some Philadelphians, he becomes a kind of symbol, a stand-in for every abused, neglected child who didn't get the chances they deserved. The DNA from his exhumation goes into cold case files, waiting for technology to catch up. And technology does catch up. Over the next 2 decades, DNA analysis goes from something mainly used to confirm paternity or connect suspects to active crime scenes to a powerful tool for solving decades-old mysteries. We see cold cases across the country solved using not just law enforcement databases, but public genealogy sites, places where ordinary people upload their DNA to find relatives and build family trees. Investigative genetic genealogy turns out to be a game changer. Instead of needing the exact suspect's DNA on file, investigators can take an unknown profile, say, from a crime scene or an unidentified body, and look for partial matches among distant cousins. Once they find those, genealogists build out family trees, narrowing possibilities until they identify the most likely individual. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, this technique has helped unmask unidentified victims and long-hunted offenders from cases that predate the internet by decades. And the boy in the box is exactly the kind of case people dream of solving with these new tools. Behind the scenes, genealogists and detectives start working with his DNA. It's degraded. Old samples rarely cooperate the way fresh ones do, but with modern technology, they manage to build a usable profile. They upload that profile, carefully and under law enforcement protocols, to genealogical databases where people have voluntarily consented to this kind of use. Somewhere out there, a distant relative of the boy has uploaded their own DNA to learn about their ancestry. The computers find a match. Not a parent, not a sibling, but a cousin, far enough out that this person has never heard of a missing child in their own family. For them, he's a branch they didn't know existed. From that match, genealogists start doing what they do best, building a family tree backwards and forwards, using birth records, marriage certificates, obituaries, and public documents. They narrow in on a couple who lived in the Philadelphia area in the early 1950s. They see that this couple had a child whose birth is recorded, but whose life doesn't show up in the usual ways. No school enrollment records, no later addresses, no obvious sign that he grew up and entered adulthood. In 2021, behind closed doors, they believe they know the boy's name. It takes another year of work to confirm it to the level where police and prosecutors are willing to stand up and say it publicly. On December 8, 2022, in a press conference watched by people around the country, the Philadelphia Police Department announces that America's unknown child is unknown no more. The boy in the box, they say, was a 4-year-old named Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born on January 13, 1953. You can hear the emotion in the voices at that podium as they say his name out loud. For some of the detectives and genealogists who worked this case, this is not just a procedure, it's the culmination of years of effort. They put up a photograph, not the old post-mortem images, but a forensic reconstruction of what Joseph might have looked like in life. Large eyes, small mouth, the features of a little boy who should have had a future. Police explain that using Joseph's DNA and genealogical sleuthing, they have identified his biological parents. Both, they say, are now deceased. He also has living half-siblings, people who grew up never knowing that somewhere they had a brother whose body lay unidentified in a box. For privacy and investigative reasons, the police don't immediately release the parents' names at that press conference. But in the weeks that follow, local reporting uncovers more details. His parents were young when he was born and were never married to each other. Each eventually married someone else. One side of his family had already experienced adoption with another child. There are hints of complicated family dynamics, secrets, and decisions that ripple down decades. But here's the thing that hits everyone hardest. In all the records available, police files, newspapers, archived reports, there is no missing person report filed for Joseph. No one in 1957 ever called authorities to say, "My 4-year-old is gone." Think about what that implies. Either the people raising him were directly responsible for his death and disposal and wanted to erase him completely, or he was passed along quietly, taken in informally by someone else, outside any official system, until he ended up in a situation where he was abused, malnourished, and killed. Either way, the systems that existed to protect children in the 1950s never even got a chance to try. There were no welfare checks. No school noticing his absence, because he was never old enough to be enrolled. No pediatrician flagging abuse, or if there was, it never made it into a record investigators could find later. He lived and died almost entirely off the books. With his name finally restored, the question everyone asks is obvious. Now what? Does knowing who he was tell us who killed him? Authorities are careful in how they answer that. They say the case is still open. They say they have not ruled out anyone, and that the identification has given them new avenues to explore. People who knew Joseph's parents, relatives who might remember a quiet family scandal or a child who appeared and then disappeared, neighbors who saw something odd in a row house window in West Philadelphia in the mid-1950s. But they also acknowledge the reality of time. Most of the adults who would have been directly involved in Joseph's life are gone. The people who might have inflicted his injuries or turned a blind eye to them are likely already beyond the reach of any court. The living relatives who have suddenly learned that their family tree includes this little boy are dealing with shock, grief, and in some cases, defensive anger. No one wants to believe such a thing could have happened in their family. And so, even with the power of DNA and a name etched in stone, the central mystery shifts rather than disappears. For more than 60 years, the question was, who is he? Now it's, who failed him? Was it one person? Several? A whole chain of caregivers and relatives, each pretending not to see what was happening right in front of them? As part of the renewed focus on Joseph's case, the city changes his grave again. On what would have been his 70th birthday, in January 2023, a new memorial is unveiled at Ivy Hill Cemetery. It now bears not just the phrase America's unknown child, but his full name, Joseph Augustus Zarelli. People gather in the cold to watch this new stone be set in place. Some of them were alive in 1957. Others grew up hearing about the boy in the box as a kind of grim local legend. Now they say his name out loud in a way no one did when he was alive. It's a strange, bittersweet kind of justice. Because on one hand, it's a beautiful thing that this child, who was dumped in the woods like garbage, is now remembered, honored, and visited. On the other hand, he had to die and wait 65 years for that to happen. If you zoom out, Joseph's story becomes more than just a tragic true crime case. It becomes a mirror reflecting how society treated vulnerable children in the mid-20th century, and how, even now, kids can slip through the cracks. In the 1950s, there was no centralized database for missing children. If a kid disappeared and their caregivers didn't say anything, authorities often had no way of knowing that child ever existed beyond a birth certificate stuffed in a drawer. Child abuse itself was, in many cases, treated as a private family matter. Neighbors might suspect, might hear, might even see bruises, but they were often reluctant to interfere. Doctors might treat injuries without fully investigating their cause. There was no internet to amplify concerns, no mandatory reporting laws as we know them today, and far less public awareness of how common abuse actually was. Joseph lived at the intersection of all of that. He was young enough not to be in school. He appears to have been malnourished and injured repeatedly without any system catching it. When he died, the person or people responsible didn't have to fool a high-tech surveillance state. They just had to put him in a box and hope the world moved on. And for a long time it did. When we talk about who failed him, it's easy to focus solely on his family or on whoever raised him. But there's a broader failure here too. A failure of community. If anyone around him suspected something was wrong and stayed silent. A failure of systems, that there were so few safety nets for children who weren't publicly claimed and cared for. We see echoes of this in other cases today. Kids who are homeschooled on paper but never really taught, children kept off the grid by abusive parents, families who move frequently and use isolation to keep their secrets. The difference now is that we have more tools to detect those patterns if we're willing to look. Forensic genealogy, the same technology that gave Joseph his name, is now being used to identify other unknown victims, including several buried near where Joseph once lay in Potter's Field. Investigators are literally digging up the past, refusing to let these people stay anonymous forever. You could say, in a way, that Joseph's case is pushing us to rethink what we owe the dead, and by extension, the living. If we believe a 4-year-old in 1957 deserved a name, attention, and the truth about what happened to him, then kids alive today deserve robust systems that make it much harder for them to vanish in plain sight. It's also a case that highlights the human need for identity and story. For decades, people in Philadelphia visited a grave marked America's Unknown Child and felt a connection to a boy they would never meet. They brought him stuffed animals, as if he might still want something soft to hold. They prayed, if that was their tradition. They researched his case, made websites, wrote books. They couldn't change what happened to him, but they could refuse to let him be forgotten. When Joseph's name was finally announced, you could feel, even through a screen, that it mattered. Not because it solved everything, but because calling someone by their name acknowledges that they were more than a victim. They were a person. When you're listening to a story like this, especially as a true crime fan, it's easy to get pulled into the mystery. Who did it? How did they get away with it? What twist will the DNA reveal next? That's natural. Our brains are wired to want puzzles solved. But with Joseph, the who might never be fully answered. There may never be a neat reveal, no courtroom verdict, no elderly suspect led away in handcuffs. The responsible adults may have died years ago, never telling anyone what they did. So the question becomes, what do we do with a story that doesn't give us that clean ending? One answer is, we let it change how we see the quiet, unglamorous parts of life. We remember that somewhere, a man saw a box with a child in it and walked away. Yes, he was scared about his own situation. Yes, the boy was almost certainly already dead. But that instinct, to protect yourself first, to avoid inconvenience, is the same instinct that keeps people from calling in abuse they suspect today. We remember that neighbors often see more than they admit, that if a kid looks too thin, too bruised, too scared, it's not nosy to ask questions. It might be the difference between life and death. We remember that systems are only as good as the people who run them. That even the best laws on paper don't mean much if teachers, doctors, and social workers are overworked, under-resourced, or not taken seriously when they raise red flags. And we remember that people can be both incredibly cruel and incredibly kind. Someone beat this child, starved him, cut his hair roughly before or after death, and abandoned him in a box. Other people spent decades of their lives trying to give him his name back. If you're watching this and you happen to live in the Philadelphia area, especially if you have older relatives who were around in the 1950s, it's worth asking gently if they remember anything. Stories about a child who appeared and then disappeared, whispered scandals nobody talked about. Police still say they're open to tips. Sometimes small memories, when combined with genealogical evidence, can finally connect the last dots. For the rest of us, Joseph's story is a reminder that some of the most powerful tools in true crime now aren't just fingerprints and ballistics, but family trees and the willingness of ordinary people to share their DNA to help identify the nameless. Of course, that comes with its own debates about privacy, consent, and how far we want law enforcement to reach into our genetic data. Those are serious conversations, and they're happening right now in legislatures and living rooms. But at the heart of that discussion, you can put a face, a 4-year-old boy in a cardboard box in 1957 who finally, after 65 years, had someone stand up and say, his name was Joseph. He mattered. He never got to go to kindergarten, never got to ride a bike down the sidewalk, or argue about bedtime, or decide what he wanted to be when he grew up. He had 4 birthdays. That's it. So wherever you are right now, maybe on a commute, maybe lying in bed with headphones in, I'd ask you to take a quiet moment in your own head and say his name. Joseph Augustus Zarelli. A son, a brother, a child who lived and died mostly unseen. We can't go back to Susquehanna Road in 1957 and stop whoever carried that box into the brush. We can't put a warm coat on him or take him by the hand and walk him back to safety. What we can do is refuse to let the world forget that he was here. And we can let his story push us to look a little closer at the kids around us now. The quiet one next door, the child who always seems hungry, the little voice that says, something's not right. Because the real lesson of the boy in the box isn't just about DNA or cold case breakthroughs. It's about making sure that, in our time, no child has to wait 65 years for someone to notice they were missing.